It's my pleasure to introduce Julia Stasch, the interim president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, who's been a true champion for the collection of issues we're discussing here today and this work. So please join me in a warm welcome for Julia.
So thank you, Kathy, and let me add my welcome. Thanks to both you and to Chase for your partnership in what is now the second effort together, our second How Housing Matters National Conference. When Kathy asked those of you who were here at the last conference, I wanted to make sure we all remembered that wonderful moment when Secretary Sebelius reminded us that she was a fan of Lady Gaga and really envied her meat dress. For me, that was a highlight of the conference. But let me also thank Lynn Ross and Rochelle Levitt of HUD PD&R, Maya Brennan and the team from the National Housing Conference, Katya Zelyat and Aliyah Reich, the National Building Museum, and a special thanks, really, to Yana Kachoris from MacArthur, who directs the housing research work. She's joined here today by her colleague, Mio Vodapish, who's responsible for the work in housing preservation, including the link between preservation and energy efficiency. Thanks to all of you for getting us to today for what promises to be a terrific event. So today's conference is about leveraging the great work of our over 40 research grantees and of all the others who have been working on ways in which stable, high-quality, affordable housing can mean better health, better education outcomes, and better opportunities for children, families, and communities. Now, of course, at the very basic level, housing is shelter, but we all know that it's much more than that. We know, those of us in the room and many others, we know that housing is where children begin to experience and interact with their environment and then move beyond that to the neighborhood and to their school. We all know that housing shapes our worldview and it shapes our opportunities. And sadly, we also know that except in times of crisis, housing is not a top priority in policy debates and in budget allocations. Sometimes there's no evidence, but if there is, it may not answer pressing policy questions. Or we also know that sometimes policymakers are actually more interested in stories and anecdotes. But as a matter of fact, all of this is changing. The evidence we'll hear about today and the innovative programs that are being seeded across the country, coupled with an increasingly powerful doing what works movement, it may have the potential to put housing in the top tier of important policy issues. Now, of course, housing is not an end in and of itself, but we will see today, and it will definitely be shown, that housing is a powerful mechanism through which we can tackle some of the most important issues we face as a society. Each of the speakers have already mentioned some of those issues, but of course they fundamentally start with how our children thrive and grow and learn, and how our elderly age with dignity and the support they deserve. Another sad thing is, of course, that tight budgets are certain to continue, so that to be effective, governments at all levels will have to turn to programs that produce the greatest return on investment. So MacArthur comes to today with a deep passion for housing, over 20 years, with an investment of more than $300 million, leveraging billions more. We've focused on decent, stable, affordable housing for low and moderate income families. Now, we help build the field of community development financial institutions, one of the most important sources for support for affordable housing. Other housing efforts have included leadership in Chicago around the transformation of public housing. Our promotion of rental housing as a critical element in a more balanced national housing policy. On high volume preservation of affordable rental housing, and the high-level bipartisan commission on new directions in housing policy in the wake of the housing crisis. Now, much of this work is on track or complete. The work in public housing produced a substantial literature about mixed income development and the resident experience, and a range of practical interventions as well. A major evaluation is underway of the Window of Opportunity Rental Housing Preservation Initiative, but work is still going on there on energy efficiency and multifamily rental housing. And there are program-related investments in use by housing owners through the end of the decade. Now, the Bipartisan Policy Center Housing Commission recommendations laid the groundwork for an active debate and 2 key bipartisan housing finance reform bills. Now, we are really proud of all of this work, but we're even more proud of the fact that it was done by our grantees and partners, many of whom are here today. Now, the How Housing Matters Research Initiative, our topic today, with its more than 40 research grants, will continue to provide findings through 2017. With all of our research grants now awarded, our focus is on building the momentum as these findings emerge, generating a robust dialogue around the policy and the practical implications of the research. Our goal, through a variety of tactics, including the meeting today, is to begin to build an appetite for this evidence-based policy and practice, and to make powerful links between and among people who care about housing and people who care about education and jobs and health and all other areas, all on behalf of a more powerful and positive set of opportunities and outcomes for individuals, families, and communities. Now, we need the expertise of those who have worked long and with passion on housing, but we also need the fresh perspective and energy from new partners in other fields. Now, a perfect example of a new perspective in both housing and related fields is the gentleman who's going to join me on the podium, and I'm going to slowly turn to my left for the cue that he's actually here. He is. So before I ask him to join me on the stage, let me tell you a little bit about Secretary Julian Castro. Like another terrific secretary and friend of mine who came before him, Secretary Castro assumes leadership of HUD from his role as mayor of the city of San Antonio. During his tenure there, he became known as a national leader in urban issues. In 2010, he spurred, I'm pretending I know something about sports, he spurred the Decade of Downtown, an initiative to spark investment in San Antonio's Center City and older neighborhoods, attracting $350 million in private sector resources. Now, San Antonio's East Side is the only neighborhood in America that has received funding under 3 key Obama administration revitalization initiatives: Choice Neighborhoods, Promise Neighborhoods, and the Byrne Criminal Justice Program. With a BA from Stanford and a JD from Harvard, he worked his way up from city council to the mayor's office and now to secretary of what we all agree is one of the most important federal agencies. Now, we look forward to hearing more about his vision for HUD as the Department of Opportunity and his perspective on tackling our nation's housing challenges and integrating housing as a platform for health, education, and opportunity. So please join me in welcoming our 16th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sit over here.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I just wanted to make sure that you all in the audience know that there's a card on your chairs. Secretary Castro has agreed to take a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please note it and someone will be around to collect it. So let's get right to the heart of the matter. What does the notion of how housing matters mean to you? What does decent, safe, and affordable housing, what has it meant in your life?
Well, first of all, Julia, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone for being here and to MacArthur for being a part of this, as well as the National Building Museum. For me, I think like just about everyone, having a decent, affordable, safe place to live essentially meant stability. It was a foundation in my life and my brother's life to be able to first not have to worry about whether we were going to have a roof over our head, but secondly, to be able to access decent education, to be able to access certain amenities in life, which I think enriched our lives. My brother and I grew up with my mother and my grandmother after the age of 8. And so our mother was raising us mostly as a single parent, and we were attending public schools in San Antonio, Texas. And when we were about 12 years old, we moved from one part of the west side of San Antonio to the near northwest side of San Antonio that was a little bit of a better neighborhood, a little bit safer, with better schools, with more amenities, and that had a positive impact in my life. And what I see out there for folks across the United States is that housing does matter as a strong foundation for everything else, whether it's education, health, employment. It is a base for us to build on. That was true in my life, and I think that that's true for the majority of Americans.
So I think it's incredibly rewarding to have someone with both your personal background and your specific appreciation for housing as evidenced through your life. You bring that to HUD, but you also bring something that is critical. I've read that people say the job as mayor is the best job in the world. But one of the things that a mayor must do is actually understand what it is that his constituents need. The mayor is well positioned to respond to those. At HUD, you're at a different level, national response, but harder to, harder to actually get things done on the ground. But one of your most well-known efforts in San Antonio was SA 2020, where you ask residents to develop a vision for the city. Talk a little bit about this experience and what you learned about the process and how you might bring what you learned to your leadership at HUD.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I was born in San Antonio. I grew up in San Antonio. When I first thought about going into public service, it was because I got away from San Antonio. And for the first time in my life, I could see sort of the good, and I don't want to say the bad, but the challenges of the city when I compared it to where I was at Stanford in the Bay Area. And I could see in the Bay Area that you had a place that was higher income level, higher education level, more entrepreneurial. At the same time in San Antonio, a place that was very culturally rich, that was family oriented. I used to like to say that it was the kind of place that even though it had 1 million people, if 2 people passed each other on the street downtown, they would still look each other in the eye. That doesn't happen in a lot of the biggest cities in the United States or in the world. There's a guardedness, a sense of disconnection between people that is part of the urban life. So my interest in public service was for the city, how could you combine the best of those 2 communities, entrepreneurial, educational, educated, higher income, but also still with a sense of community. And SA 2020 was about asking the community to dream about the next decade in the city. And so we had a 6-month-long process that just about 5,000 San Antonians participated in. And the basic question was, what kind of city do we want to be on Friday, September 25th, 2020, which was 10 years after we kicked it off. And what I learned was, first, that when you ask folks to dream and to give input, that the people you represent are, they have their own ideas and they are very smart about the future of the community. Sometimes I think in politics and in policymaking, we underestimate the insight of folks who are living their daily lives. And this was a bottom-up approach to try and get great ideas for the city. I learned that that can be fruitful. Secondly, I learned something that I'm putting to use at HUD, the value of focusing not just on investments or inputs, but on outcomes, on measuring things and ensuring that we're tracking what kind of progress we're making. So as part of SA 2020, we set goals in 11 different vision areas: economic development and job creation, downtown redevelopment, and so forth. And at HUD, I'm building on the work that Secretary Donovan started with HUDstat to also measure outcomes and track our progress.
Interestingly, you have described HUD as the Department of Opportunity. What does that mean, and how does that connect to how housing matters?
Yeah. Yeah, I call HUD the Department of Opportunity, and the reason that I call it the Department of Opportunity is because I see housing as the keystone, as I said, the foundation for creating more opportunity in people's lives. The President has said that the zip code that you live in shouldn't determine your destiny, that no matter where you live, you should have the opportunity to reach the middle class in the United States. And I see decent, safe, affordable housing as the base of that. And then at HUD, basically, what we're trying to do, if you break down our main programs, 86% of our budget is basically keeping a roof over people's heads. And if you look at, for instance, what people know as Section 8 vouchers, but the tenant-based vouchers, not the project-based rental assistance. It's essentially trying to get folks give people the choice to get into the neighborhoods of their choice, and hopefully lower poverty neighborhoods with better schools and good amenities. The other thing that we're very focused on, though, is what about the people who are in high poverty neighborhoods? We're focused on a very place-based approach to try and lift up those neighborhoods. And so I think when we think about the link between opportunity and the work that is part of how housing matters, it's how are you mindful of both of those approaches? Giving folks the choice to move about the community, the city, so that they can find those better opportunities in life, education, jobs, transportation, but also through things like promise neighborhoods in the Department of Education, choice neighborhoods in HUD, the sustainable communities, that's EPA, transportation, and HUD collaboration, our Promise Zones initiative. How do you improve those high poverty neighborhoods so that we're not just trying to get people out, but we're trying to lift up the urban core of communities and make a difference there? And at the end of the day, success to me and the opportunity will be how many more of those young people graduate from high school and go on to college or a successful career. For people who are at working age, how many more of those folks who are in public or subsidized housing actually go on and get job training and get better jobs so that they make more income? And if you're elderly or you're disabled, are you living a strong quality of life in your golden years in a safe neighborhood that is comfortable? I think at the end of the day, those are the outcomes that we want to measure.
It seems to me that that's a tall order for HUD alone. So, but when you think about HUD and the agencies that you've started to mention as your collaborators and a joint set of actors to be responsible for so much of what you put out there as a vision, first of all, expand a little bit on who those partners are likely to be, and how do you think you can also work together with state and local leaders to facilitate greater coordination across the policy and programmatic silos that have so characterized the federal government for so long?
Yeah, first, I think that you're very right, and I'm sure y'all have seen it as well, that all of us tend to work in silos. And I saw this at the local level as mayor. You would think, at least at the local level, that the transit agency would work with the community college district, would work with the city, would work with the housing authority, but that usually actually is not the case. If you think about what happens at the local level, for instance, a lot of times there's a COG, a Council of Governments, but my experience has been that oftentimes those Council of Governments are somewhat stale. So what we try to do in San Antonio, and what I see a lot of communities doing now, is directly principal to principal, the leaders of these different organizations working together on a monthly basis and talking about, okay, well, what are the investments that you're making in this part of town or in this community? What are we doing over here? How can we coordinate that? How can we get a bigger bang out of the buck and have a greater impact? So it's local leadership, of course, it's state leadership, because a lot of dollars still flow through the state governments, and state government policy can have a profound impact on how far we can go in helping communities. And then at the federal level, I believe that one of the lasting significant contributions of President Obama will be that he challenged federal departments I think more than any recent leader, to work across silos. So at the very beginning, setting up these 17 different federal agencies that were working together to try and figure out in a place-based way how we could improve communities. Sustainable communities was one of the first efforts that came out of there. Today, we're focused on things like promise zones. And then the other piece of that is the private and philanthropic sector, which today we could not accomplish what we're trying to accomplish without the philanthropic and private sector that has stepped up significantly over the years as resources for places like HUD have diminished. In 1981, for instance, HUD had 16,500 employees. As of the end of the fiscal year, this year that we just ended, we had 8,490 employees. So you talk about declining resources and expanding need, and it means that we have to find partners everywhere, at the local, state, and federal level, and in the private sector.
So tell me, who are the agencies that you think are critical partners to you? And how are you going to make sure that they look at housing evidence as they consider their own policies?
Yeah, I see as some of the most critical. First, let me start with colleagues, the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, the EPA, these agencies that essentially work on matters that deal with fundamentally what is opportunity in this country, being able to get a good education, where someone lives and how that's impacted, how that impacts whether they can get a good education, the convenience or access to being able to get to jobs that transportation involves, the issues that we faced in our Green and Healthy Homes initiative, whether it's folks dealing with lead-based paint or folks living near environmentally sensitive sites. So this is something that each of those cabinet secretaries has been working on for a while in this administration, and I'm sort of the new kid on the block. I've only been on the job about 2.5 months, but they are already working together as a group, and I'm glad to join them. Beyond that, I think it's the philanthropic sector, the private sector nationally, that also has the benefit of seeing great demonstration projects that are happening around the nation and then taking the best practices and rewarding communities across the United States that adopt those. And then, of course, we constantly work with state and local governments, but at HUD, particularly local communities, and share best practices and try and get from them examples of what is really working out there.
So I think the folks in the audience would join me in urging you to make sure that those collaborations are not only around practice, but are around this emerging body of evidence that crosses the agency areas of interest, so that folks that are making transportation and education and health policy can look to the body of evidence and see how central housing is to achieving the outcomes that they are interested in.
Sure, and I think Kathy O'Regan was here a little bit earlier, and out of our policy and research division, they are very focused on that kind of cross-agency collaboration and research, and so I think that you bring up a very good point, and we want to be mindful of that, and want everyone else to be mindful of that as well.
So before we take some questions from the audience, I want to ask you one final question, and that is, everybody here today will be hearing from researchers and developers and educators and service providers about what works and the stakes for getting housing done right. So what is your message to them as they embark on the day? If you had one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation, what would that be?
It would be to use your voice to impress upon your communities and your colleagues the centrality of housing as the prime foundation for us to work on creating opportunity in people's lives. And that really is the fundamental thrust of what y'all are doing, but to continue to proselytize about that, because that, frankly, is not the way most folks have seen housing out there. Most folks see housing as, okay, we have a roof over somebody's head, but haven't thought of it in communities as the basis from which to spread opportunity And we're very much on that wavelength at HUD, and I do believe that the administration is as well. And we are seeing communities across the United States that do get it. But I don't think that that's a commonly held view right now.
So I'm waiting for a couple of questions, which I hope are tough and challenging, because I think you're up to it. So. Thank you. Okay. So can you, oh, here's my favorite question. How do you actually see the future of housing finance? I could stop right there, but it actually goes on to say, with regard to the wind down of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the question. Of course, this has been the subject of a tremendous amount of debate and back and forth. And my hope is that Johnson Crapo, with what will, of course, be some compromises in between here and there, getting through the process, that we will have housing finance reform that replaces the current system. I think that most folks agree that the current system is not sustainable over the long term, and that we can find a better path, of course, with the protection of ensuring that we have a commitment to creating more affordable housing. That's one of the, I think, benefits of the Johnson Crapo legislation. $5 billion that would go into the Housing Trust Fund that would allow for investment in affordable housing throughout the United States on a continuous basis, and I think alleviate some of this pressure that we see out there. We have a rental affordability crisis right now. But then secondly, also ensure that for communities of color and folks of modest means, that with the flex fee, which I grant you is new, but that we do have a manner to incentivize folks to continue to lend to communities that traditionally have not been lent to in the same way. Just the other day, I'm sure folks saw that lending to minority communities was at a 13 or 14-year low in the United States, and the credit markets are very tight right now. My belief is that housing finance reform is part of the answer to that, as long as we can have these legitimate safeguards in place to ensure that everybody is able to take advantage of the opportunity.
It's so funny when I read the questions, I can actually tell, if not the person who wrote it, exactly what group of people it might have come from. So here's one that actually I think goes to the heart of a historic sort of issue. There's a challenge which HUD faces, and that is the distinct differences in its regional offices and where policy differs by each office. How will you unite these offices and bring about the kind of consistency that lets policy flow from place to place and people build on what works in one place for application in another? Yeah,
HUD now has, as I mentioned, about 8,500 employees and a set of regional offices throughout the country that I've been visiting. And part of the feeling, I think, in several of our regional offices is that over time, decision-making within HUD has gotten more and more centralized, and that folks genuinely wonder, are these regional offices going to have the expertise in terms of personnel and also the authority to make important decisions the way, at least to hear it told to me, they used to. And that's something that we're evaluating right now. How can we give our regional and our field offices, because it's the field offices as well, the personnel and the expertise that they need to be able to smoothly make decisions that help things move faster on the ground. I do think that particularly our field offices have been decimated over the years with the decrease in the number of employees that we've seen, basically about cut in half. But the standard that I'm using is one of customer service. What is the best model for customer service? To be able to make a good decision that is thorough, that serves the customer well, and as quickly as possible. Sometimes the answer to that is to have a centralized decision-making process. Sometimes the answer to that is to have a less centralized process. And it's really weeding through that and understanding where the differences are, where the nuance is, that I think is the challenge. And that's part of what I'm trying to pick up in visiting these regional offices and in talking to my staff at HUD. And I anticipate that at the end of the day, that we will probably invest in some places more in our regional and our field offices.
So I think that's really encouraging. I hope that part of that is an even more committed attention to the value of waivers awarded in one place and making them automatically applicable in other places with similar situations. I know that that's been a frustration for a long time. Now, can you say more about choice neighborhoods, sustainable communities, and how the federal departments are working together? And I think bringing it home to San Antonio, how has it changed from these individual efforts and the combination of them?
Yeah, our choice neighborhood effort really is building on the work that came before, Hope 6 and other initiatives that, but trying to look at not just how can we do the same old thing, but how can we holistically improve communities of public housing residents and bring in these other opportunities. For instance, in Chicago, they have a choice neighborhood effort that will include resources like a job training center and access to early childhood education for parents of young children. So it's thinking about housing again as this vehicle to create more opportunity. Sustainable communities was, I believe, the first significant effort out of the gate for the administration that involved the EPA, the Department of Transportation, and HUD. And the magic here really is that oftentimes, as you all know, in low-income communities, you find the challenge of subpar transportation options and also environmental conditions that are not conducive to healthy living. And the question was, how do we look at those issues holistically and try and eliminate those environmental hazards where they exist, improve transit conditions so people can get to work or to school more conveniently, and then lift up the quality of the community in general in these low-income areas. For San Antonio, we made a decision very early on to try and mirror what the Obama administration was doing in trying to work together and break through the silos. And what it has meant on the east side of San Antonio, the east side of San Antonio traditionally was the largely African-American side of San Antonio, and now it's a combination of African-American and Hispanic. In fact, I believe it's the only place that has a college that is both a Hispanic serving institution and a historically black college. St. Philip's College is part of the Alamo Colleges. And Trinity University, one of our universities down there, started leading an effort along with the United Way to put together a comprehensive plan that involved all of these things: improving education, improving housing, the environmental aspect, the transportation aspect. And out of that effort, they got Promise Neighborhood Investment, Choice Neighborhood Investment, and the Byrne Criminal Justice Investment, as well as the Promise Zone designation. How are we measuring success? In San Antonio, we were measuring success along these outcomes that I mentioned earlier. So how many more young people in that zone, in that Promise Zone, actually graduate from high school and go on to college? How many more of the working age folks are employed, in 2 years versus when you started? How many more of the houses that were vacant before are actually rehabilitated and have residents that are living there now? And those outcomes are being measured. Of course, the measurement started relatively recently, but to give you an example of that, at our high school in that zone, we saw the graduation rate go up from something in the high 40s to the low 80s in a matter of 2 or 3 years. And we saw absenteeism drop significantly in the feeder schools around that high school and at the high school itself. So these concrete measurements that suggest that folks are on the right track over there.
So you said earlier that you thought that state governments could have a big impact, but what do you think are some of the key initiatives that you would like to see undertaken by the states to complement what you're doing and what you see happening at the local level?
I think a couple of things. Of course, we deal with states in terms of the tax credits and having smart tax credit policy. I think states have reached different conclusions on this, but for instance, in Texas recently, when tax credit applications are considered, they're giving more points now to applicants that are putting affordable housing in areas that are not higher poverty areas. So it used to be really, if you wanted to get these tax credits, you'd walk in there and of course put it in the same old place that you did before, because that's where you would get the least amount of NIMBYism, of blowback. And I think there's a more, I would say, fair and more nuanced policy now in many places about not cordoning off one area and creating high concentration of poverty, but instead incentivizing developers to put affordable housing in different areas of a community, these areas that have better schools, that have a lower poverty level, that the research suggests when a young person grows up in those areas, they're going to have a better shot to graduate from high school and move on to the middle class.
So here's something that is increasingly important. How do you think climate change is going to impact housing? The funding, the priorities, what's the political will? Is it an opportunity for innovation?
Absolutely, and there certainly is the political will in the administration, and I believe with many members of Congress. So one of the things that we just did was that we kicked off this National Disaster Resilience Competition, a $1 billion competition out there to encourage communities around the United States that have, between the years 2011 and 2013, had a national disaster declaration that includes about 67 different areas, 48 states, and plus the rest are localities, specific localities that can compete for this money. And what we're asking them to do is to take a holistic view on becoming more resilient as a community, including in their housing, in general disaster preparedness, and we're excited about what we're going to get to see, you know, the applications that we're going to get back, because we think that in the same way that that Race to the Top in the education realm encouraged states to be innovative and to reach for something higher in terms of educational excellence, that with regard to preparing for climate change and the next disaster that a community might face, that this disaster resilience competition is going to encourage the same innovation. And even for the communities that ultimately do not prevail in the competition, it gets them thinking about how they can adopt better policies and be smarter about preparing for climate change.
So over the last 4 years or so, there's really been an increasing focus on preservation as an essential piece of the policy pie. But what is HUD doing about increasing the supply? That has a different kind of dynamic in the housing market than preservation does. But talk to us about both the goal of increasing supply, but the challenges because of cost.
Well, you're right. Every year, for instance, in public housing, we lose about 10,000 units to disrepair. And so under the leadership of Secretary Donovan, one of the things that was launched was a Rental Assistance Demonstration Project, or RAD, which is allowing housing authorities to work with the private sector to renovate units across the United States. The first allowance was for 60,000 units among different housing authorities across the nation to be renovated, and we got applications for 185,000 units. So there's legislation on the table right now that would allow for the authorization of 185,000 units to be part of a rental assistance demonstration. Some of these units are not in disrepair in the sense that they are still habitable. Some of them are worse off, and so it is having the effect of bringing units back to life that were not habitable. We also are hopeful that the Housing Trust Fund will be kickstarted sometime in the not too distant future. Director Watt, I know, has had quite a lot on his plate, but we have had good conversations, and my hope is that that at some time in the near future that the flip will be switched on, and we'll have at least some modicum of revenue to create more affordable housing units out there. So those are a couple of the things that we're working on.
Well, that would be terrific. We've been talking about that for a very long time.
That's true. That's true.
So,
but I think it's getting closer.
I hope so. Now, recently at the Bipartisan Policy Center Housing Summit, you spoke eloquently about both home ownership and rental housing. How do you see the balance between those two in their contribution to national housing policy?
Both of them are fantastically important. I mean, just from my own life, when I was growing up, we never owned a home. You know, we rented the whole way through. In fact, I bought my first home after I got out of law school when I was 25 years old, and my mother still didn't own a home. My mother didn't own a home until about, 5 years ago. And so I know that for a lot of folks, renting is effectively the only option. And that's why we're focused on the programs that we have in place to help subsidize folks to get out into the market and get into a decent, affordable rental unit. It's why we're focused on these place-based initiatives that oftentimes in these lower income communities, we're dealing with a lot of rental units in the geographic area that we're working on. But home ownership, to me, really is the goal. Ultimately, you do want folks to be able to have a part of what in substance and in concept has been the American dream. And for the vast majority of Americans, that is their wealth. Their home is their wealth. And so you want folks to be able to build that wealth and be able to pass that on to the next generation. At HUD, in the way that we allocate our time and our resources, both of those types of housing take up a lot of time and energy. We're not focused on home ownership, at the expense of thinking about what's happening in terms of the rental market or vice versa. We're focused very much on both of those, and we understand that they both have an important role to play in ensuring that people can live with a decent roof over their head.
I think that it's important to acknowledge how deeply held the value is of home ownership. But I think the recent research that we funded from Hart Associates shows an increasing majority of people feel that Americans can achieve the American dream not only through owning a home. So a path that includes living in rental housing is not necessarily as stigmatized as it has been in the past.
No, I would agree with that. And I would say also that I never saw it myself personally growing up as a stigma. You know, that was just the normal. And so the viewpoint that I bring to it is that whether it's someone owning their home or someone living in a rental unit, that can still be the basis for fantastic opportunity in their lives. I do think, though, particularly with emergent communities, when you look at our communities of color, for instance, that there is something to be said for people actually building up that wealth, because that's one of the starkest differences we have with communities of color and not, is you think about the income gap. I mean, the real action is the wealth gap that exists in these communities versus the mainstream community. So there is still, I think, a very strong value in getting folks along the path of actually owning something and being able to pass that on to the next generation. And that was part of the impetus, frankly, for me being very blunt about saying that we should remove this stigma of promoting home ownership again, because I feel like these last few years, for understandable reasons, people have been very shy about promoting that in the same way. However, with the regulations that have been put in place, with the response that the lenders have put forward in terms of, I think, moving the pendulum completely in the other direction, I do think that we can find a happy medium and put that pendulum right where it belongs, with a good balance of smart regulation and also opportunity for folks to own a home.
When I read your remarks from the Housing Summit, I was a little surprised at that sentence about removing the stigma from promoting homeownership. That took me by surprise.
And also, and I think the important part of the line there was the stigma of promoting homeownership, right. Not of, I don't think homeownership has ever had a stigma to it, but certainly people going out there and saying, hey, people need to own homes, ought to own homes in the United States. Everybody got very, very shy about saying that for legitimate reasons, but I think that we've kind of gone on to the other end of the spectrum now, and we need to find a reasonable balance that protects us against going back to where we were during the housing crisis, but also opens up that opportunity for more Americans to build their wealth and own a home.
So even in that context, many communities still oppose rental housing out of a belief that owners are more engaged in the civic life of a community. Are there any strategies that you can think of that we could develop to encourage renters to be more engaged in the civic life of their community?
That is a great question, and one, of course, as a mayor and a former city councilman that I had a lot of experience with, because the usual way that it presents itself is that somebody wants to do a rental project somewhere and they need a zoning change in order to do that. And so you get a whole bunch of folks in a neighborhood association or community association that go down to their city hall, and they scream and holler and create this boogeyman a lot of times about what putting a rental apartment building or other rental units will do to the community. First of all, working with these local apartment associations. There are, apartment associations. There's an apartment association in just about every community of any size in the United States, but they're not engaged in the same way that neighborhood associations are engaged in impressing upon the local elected officials, their views. And I don't think oftentimes they're as engaged in getting their residents oriented toward impressing their views on local policymakers. It's like a dead zone in terms of engagement with the local elected official. If there's one thing that could be done to help the policymaker, it would be to get these folks connected to their local apartment association and like a neighborhood association, have these monthly meetings where they invite city council members who are going to be making these zoning decisions to also come present to them. In my, I guess, 9 years being on the city council and serving as mayor, I think that I probably went to one of those apartment association type gatherings to listen to the residents probably one time. And I can't count the number of times that I went to neighborhood or community homeowner association to go and hear the concerns of residents. So it's activating those, with the apartment association folks, activating those communities.
So you've really spoken extensively about education, environmental factors, and transportation. But some people in the audience want to understand, how do you think of the link between community health and housing? How does that come into play?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very important one. It comes into play in different ways. Sometimes, I think, in very negative ways, when we're trying to remove lead-based paint, fund efforts to remove lead-based paint from units, in issues that the EPA deals with in terms of negative environmental challenges around public housing or other types of housing. For us, it's really about how can we use the fact that we're providing this opportunity in public housing and subsidizing housing as a springboard to also encourage folks to be healthier. So how do we think about their location or their proximity to a park or recreational facilities? How do we think about getting information out to folks? Now I'm thinking about the public housing context of what recreational options are, or connecting them to city programs that offer free exercise classes. I know we were doing that in San Antonio. One of the issues that I brought up that I don't have a good answer on right now is what are we doing with respect to our public housing community in terms of healthier eating, in terms of nutrition, and getting folks to think about that. This issue of smoking came up recently. The CDC just released a report about smoking in public housing and looking at whether it makes sense now essentially to ban smoking in public housing. That's not the first time that's come up. And HUD has been working over the last few years with housing authorities across the United States to encourage them to adopt smarter policies about smoking in our public housing units. I think that we need to perhaps be more aggressive than we have been. So whether it's nutrition, or it's an issue like smoking, or its proximity to resources that will help folks live a healthier life, what we want is to get folks the information and the resources that they need to make healthier choices in life. And it is something that's on the radar screen. It's something that I consider very important, again, to this issue of the opportunity to live a better life. And it's one that I think that probably HUD needs to look at more investment in the future.
Final question. What do you believe is your greatest challenge as HUD Secretary?
The greatest challenge that we have is that the need always outpaces the resources. The waiting list that we have for folks out there for our vouchers, the fact that we have public housing units, like I said, 10,000 a year that are going into disrepair, is that we have a fantastic need out there, and the resources that we have to address it are not either what they used to be relative to the size of the need, and we don't see that resource environment changing significantly with the Congress that we have. That means that we have to be creative. That means that we have to look at things like RAD, that we have to look at these place-based initiatives that multiply the effect of our work. So it's that need and the dearth of resources that I think is our greatest challenge, and the response has to be, how do we collaborate and how do we innovate with what we have already to produce more?
Thanks to the audience for a set of terrific questions. I think that you were completely in command after only how many days in the job, months in the job?
Yeah.
I think that your experience, your personal experience, and your role as mayor, it's my sense, and I'm sure it's shared amongst the audience, that this is perfect preparation for your leadership role at HUD. So thank you so much for such thoughtful comments.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.